Hello, I'm Marlene Resnick-Simons. Welcome to Part 2, Chaos Theory, Corporal Punishment, and Racism. In Part 1, I talked about the concept of sensitive dependence on initial conditions and went on to establish that the first 4 years of life are the time of initial conditions for the establishment of the mental, emotional health going forward of an individual. This second part of the series focuses on the relationship of hurtful and humiliating practices visited upon children that can nurture hate, including racism, in later years. Please understand that this is only one small sliver of influence in the life of an individual, but it can still be powerful. Corporal punishment, the practices of hitting and hurting, have been proven to undermine the development of impulse control and cooperation on the part of children. Those practices result in negative outcomes in physical and emotional health, as well as in educational outcomes. Such treatment undermines the development of the social emotional skills our children need for their current and future relationships. The anger, frustration, and rage developed in the early years from being hit, hurt, and humiliated do not disappear. They may be acted out on other children, or those feelings may go underground until that individual is in the role of power, whether as a policeman, a parent, a gang member, or a member of a mob. When that rage has a stage upon which to be acted out. These findings are consistent with those of other studies on the effects of physical punishment on children, said Miss Lynn So, senior principal psychologist at the Psychological Trauma Support Service, Women's and Children's Hospital, a member of the Sing Health Group. Commenting on the study, she said, physical punishment is a serious public health problem throughout the world, and it profoundly affects the mental health of children and the societies in which we live. In the United States, studies show that approximately 65% of adults approve of physical punishment, and about 50% of families use physical punishment to discipline children. Studies show that children who are hit identify with the aggressor and are more likely to become hitters themselves. That is, bullies and future abusers of their own children and partners. They tend to learn to use violent behavior as a way to deal with stress and interpersonal disputes. Numerous studies document that physical punishment is associated with higher rates of delinquency, increased aggression, increased mental health problems, criminal and antisocial behavior, and a preponderance for abusing their own children in adulthood. In addition, violent behavior is more prevalent as a way to deal with interpersonal disputes. It's clear that corporal punishment is commonly used in approximately half of American families. Murray Strauss in 1994 in his massive study found that more than 90% of children experience corporal punishment. That imprint on our culture is evident today. The research indicates that children between the ages of 2 and 4 years old are the most common recipients of hurtful physical punishments, at a time when they are ill-equipped to fully understand why those on whom they depend for survival are hurting them. Because numerous studies indicate that children identify with the aggressor in such situations, we can see the pervasive tendency to act out the feelings of rage and aggression on others when those children become adults. This is particularly true when they are provided a culturally acceptable target for those feelings. Today, we are dealing with the results of the physical punishment of children who are now adults. Racism and other targeted forms of hate in this discussion are identifying are identified in a very narrow way. It has been used as a way to create so-called legitimate cultural targets for bigotry. One cannot understate the destructive force of racism on our culture, but what is the purpose of racism? One purpose is to identify a target, to create a scapegoat to which repressed rage can be legitimately directed. Racism is far bigger and deeper than I have the expertise to explain. For my purposes, I am referring to it as one means of providing a target for an underlying rage. But where does that rage come from? There is no debate about the brutal history of slavery, about the ongoing organized institutional racism, and the blatant white supremacist voices that give such hate a target. Racism is complex in the insidious ways that it is prompted. However, the data is clear. Racism kills. It reduces opportunities. It reduces access to life-sustaining resources in the form of money, education, healthcare, and housing. Racism is strongly supported through economic, academic, and social service institutions that underlie much of our society. The structural racism that exists is invisible to so many whose immediate reaction is fear-based defensiveness. The racist receives real economic benefits as well as the perceived benefit of being exceptional or better than someone else. This is a disease of many cultures, which takes many different shapes in those cultures around the world. It is embedded in language, in laws, in culture, and in practice. U.S. history includes the nearly total annihilation of the native population, as well as slavery, both powered by greed and the acquisition of land and resources. Today, we are a divided nation. Racism makes people of color a culturally acceptable target for the repressed anger carried through the early practices of hitting and hurting young children who are powerless to defend themselves. The impact of corporal punishment on young children who identify with the aggressor in their abuse. This creates a fertile environment to later act out that repressed, frustrated feelings of powerlessness and rage that come from being hurt and humiliated with no recourse and little understanding. The toxic mix of frustration and rage form a core that will seldom be changed through rational discourse. It is easily triggered and an emotional avalanche dependent on the initial conditions established in the early years of life. We cannot overestimate the profoundly negative impacts of corporal punishment practiced by many parents of young children. In addition, 17 state school systems in the United States allow corporal punishment by teachers and administrators. Hitting and hurting are considered acceptable forms of caring for and teaching the most vulnerable among us. How does one teach the laws of our nation that involve prohibitions against assault, hitting, and against slander, a form of name-calling, if that is what we are modeling for our children in our families and in our schools? This is a critical question in an environment where politics are rife with hateful and divisive messages that act as triggers for an emotional landscape that is unstable. The history of racism in America is broad and far-reaching. That level of suppressed rage always seeks a target for that early sense of powerlessness and hurt. The critical time of growth for children under the age of 4 is dramatic and far-reaching, creating a sensitive dependence on those initial emotional landscapes created upon which everything else will rest. Corporal punishment teaches children that they are not worthy of being treated well. They learn that aggression, hurtful and humiliating practices are acceptable patterns of behavior. This creates an unholy alliance between love and pain, rage and loyalty, because no matter how you are mistreated, you are expected to love and respect your parents. Such practices have a powerful negative impact on the psychological health of children who identify with their aggressor and often replicate such behavioral patterns during their childhood years and or when they become adults, as indicated by adverse childhood incident studies. The abundance of research makes clear that hitting and hurting young children is counterproductive to the results that parents generally want. In conclusion, it is time for us to eliminate the use of corporal punishment of children if we are to begin to effectively eliminate racism and other forms of culturally targeted hate in our culture. As long as we cultivate frustration and rage in young children, our culture will identify targets for that rage. We know that conflict is as basic to family life as love and cooperation. We also know that much of the conflict and violence in this world outside the family can be traced to roots in the family. Until we are ready to face this uncomfortable truth, we will be unable to deal with racism in the deep and entwined way that it exists in our culture today. We must teach our children and teens the principle upon which this country was based, that every individual, regardless of how small or powerless, is deserving of respect. We must also teach the practices of problem solving, of dealing with differences and resolving conflicts, and ways that build relationships within families, communities, and in our country as a whole. We need to teach disciplined practices that nurture growth and self-responsible behavior. If we fail in this regard, political solutions will be limited and short-lived. What we can do: 1, we can provide courses on child and adolescent development in middle and high school in order to help young people better understand the dramatic changes they experience. 2, we can provide civics education across the educational spectrum in order for young people to understand what it means to be a citizen, to understand the founding principles upon which our country is based, both rights and responsibilities. 3, we can provide education for all ages in understanding and dealing with emotions. This is another area of critical importance. The power of rage, anger, and frustration, as well as understanding depression and suicide when those feelings are turned inward. It is being felt in every part of life. 4, we can provide the knowledge, practices, and skills involved in problem solving and conflict resolution. It should be part of every school curriculum. 5, we can teach our children about the history of our country and about the history of genocide, ethnic cleansing, the Holocaust, and racism. We can teach about the laws and cultural practices and political lies that were promulgated to produce such outcomes in the United States and around the world. 6, we can provide a true accounting of an understanding of the actual history of the United States and begin a discussion about what things need to happen in order for all Americans to participate in creating a more perfect union in America in which we can all be proud. 7, we can provide parenting education in high school before most adolescents become parents so that they gain some understanding about child development, as well as an understanding about the gravity and responsibilities involved in becoming parents. You can read more in my recent book, Nobody's Perfect: Parenting in a World of Change, available where books are sold. Available in digital, print, and audio versions. Parenting in a World of Change, a program for parents, is available on teachable.com, which you can access by going to strong-happy-family.online. My name again is Marlene Resnick Simons. Thank you for your time and for your attention.